Welcome to Social Work Foundations. I'm Dr. Karen Smith-Ratabi, and we'll be covering human rights as an overview. We will look at the idea of universal rights for all with 3 core human rights areas and within the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as other related conventions and instruments. Those instruments include the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on Eliminating Discrimination Against Women, and the Convention related to disability. We will think about the United Nations as an international oversight body with government responsibilities, each country's responsibilities for realizing rights. We'll think about cultural relativism, and we'll talk about the case of Somalia, and social work as a human rights profession will round out our discussion today. So let's begin with UNICEF. That's the United Nations Children's Fund. And notice in this definition, the idea of equality and the need for people to realize their fullest potential. This idea is very much a part of social work, and we recognize that if we can't realize human rights goals, that is economic, social, cultural, civil, and political, if these goals are not promoted and preserved and defended, then we all will not realize our human rights as a whole, as a globe, and people within their individual countries. So recognize from your text that the United Nations defines human rights as, quote, those rights which are inherent in our nature and without which we cannot live as human beings. Human rights are fundamental freedoms that allow us to fully develop and use our human qualities, our intelligence, our talents, and our conscience to satisfy our spiritual needs. Recognize that this is the idea of reaching our fullest potential in all these different domains. As these human rights are inherent, we cannot be granted or taken away. They can only be violated. So they cannot be taken away. They can only be violated. And when Eleanor Roosevelt considered her work on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, she commented that the idea of human rights must begin locally. We must promote human rights in our own neighborhoods, our schools, our places of employment, and communities. And this resonates with social work, obviously, because we want to encourage people to seek their justice and equal opportunities without experiencing discrimination. She contended that if we fail to advocate for human rights close to home, we will fail in efforts to support human rights for all people throughout the world. So the idea of human rights being universal and equal. These ideas of universal applies to everyone equally, and equality is critical. In countries that sign human rights instruments and conventions, especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but all of them, we must grant the rights to everyone regardless of gender, religion, age, ethnicity, or any other reason. So this is the rights to people to have their to realize their rights without discrimination. So there are 3 kinds of human rights, and you'll see in the appendix of this presentation a summary of those 30 human rights. So we'll begin with political and civil rights, sometimes called negative freedoms. And these are the rights that protect people from governments. So freedom of speech, right to a fair trial. We can identify with that in the United States, but also around the world, there are grave concerns about freedom of speech and right to a fair trial as systems are underdeveloped or people are discriminated against. Can you think of other political and civil rights examples in your country? So let's look at social, economic, and cultural rights. Government must provide for these for their citizens: the right to an education, the right to medical care, and the right to work and equitable compensation, that is fair wages. These are considered to be positive freedoms. Let's look at the right to an education. So you'll see in Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the text that goes along with the right to an education. So the education shall be free, at least in elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education will be compulsory. Technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on basis of merit. There you go again with the ideas of discrimination, and people should be allowed to pursue their fullest potential to seek for their education. There you have the full development of human personality, strengthening the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We want to promote the understanding of tolerance and friendship among all nations, race, or religious groups, and further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. Parents have the prior right to choose the kind of education that should be given to their children. So Amnesty International, a well-respected international human rights defense organization has taken on education rights as critical to their moving forward to realizing human rights and making sure to address human rights abuses. So in this cartoon, Amnesty International provides us with two different realities. We have poverty and inequality, and then the barriers that result from these conditions and seeking an education, you can see on the left. And then you see children with a pathway to school, and this pathway is privilege, rights to not be discriminated against, rights to overcome poverty and reach their fullest potential. Again, more from Amnesty International. They recognize as an organization that school must be available only within a quick walk from a neighborhood, must be accessible to children. And that means accessibility in the classrooms. It must be accessible to all, overcoming the barriers that people with disabilities may experience. That would be reasonable accommodations in the United States. We also have to have adaptable school environments, and in which students may interact with teachers that are very flexible and available to really give students their fullest opportunity to be successful, even if they must be remediated and catch up with others, with their peers. And it's very important is the acceptability that children have the opportunity to be a part of the school environment and be accepted in the school environment. Let's move on to collective rights. We protect groups of people from discrimination. This is critical to social work, and it's core to our ideas of social justice. So we have the right to freedom of religion, the right to peace. And the idea of peace and social justice work dates back to Jane Addams and the work that she did collectively in the neighborhoods of Chicago, and then in fact did the ideas of peace when she won the Nobel Peace Prize. So the obligations of a signatory country. So governments of parties and treaties must respect the human rights documents which they sign. And that would include creating guarantees in the Constitution for human rights, not limiting individual freedom unless absolutely necessary for the well-being of the entire society, providing ways for people who have suffered human rights abuses to seek remedies in domestic courts and international courts, and then ratifying and implementing human rights instruments and treaties. That means making these human rights treaties become codified in their law. So as they protect, they must, as governments pass laws that prohibit individuals from committing human rights violations, they must prosecute and pursue civil actions for crimes and other violations. That could include domestic violence, hazardous work conditions, and discrimination. Also, governments must protect the rights to education about human rights and the importance of respecting the human rights of others. That goes along with Amnesty International's initiatives in this area. Cooperating with international community in preventing and prosecuting crimes against humanity and other violations is critical in protection. And then to fulfill rights, governments must provide free and high-quality public education. There we go again, education. We must create a public defender service to provide indigent people with access to lawyers. There you have the rights to a fair trial. Supporting civil society organizations and public participation in order to encourage freedom of expression and association. There you have the positive freedoms again. And assisting those people in need through the funding of social services programs. Here we have the heart of social work, assisting people in need through funding and social service programs, and funding public education campaigns on the right to vote. So we have access to education, access to social services, and then informing the public of their right to vote. So one of the things that comes up when you start to consider human rights, and many countries have signed these human rights declarations and conventions, is why do some human rights abuses continue to persist? And one might talk about this in terms of cultural relativism, where a culture states, well, our culture supersedes the human rights. And that simply is not true. That would be exemplified where cultures treat women as subordinate to men, and being treated less than men and lower in the rights of men is counter to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which everybody is to be treated equally and without discrimination. So we know that profound human rights abuses still exist and persist. In Somalia, it's estimated that every single woman there has experienced female genital mutilation. And while this may not be an absolute rule, it is certainly the majority of women, if not all. And then also early marriage and child brides is another problem in Somalia. Now, we know that this is a country that's been plagued with conflict, with serious inequality, some of the gravest poverty in the entire world, and today it persists. So why does female genital mutilation and early marriage for child brides continue? Well, a weak central government related to conflict over many decades, some of the cultural views of women as being subordinate. But however, I would say, even though Somalia is mainly Islamic, that Islam is not promoting female genital mutilation or early marriage of child brides in most cases. Now, you can argue with this, but the reality is equality of women is critical in Islam as well as other world religions. Some other human rights conventions. Really important is we want to think about the other conventions that emanate from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you will notice the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That would very much appeal to our discussion about female genital mutilation and early child marriage when you think about discrimination. You would also find application of this convention to our realities in the United States, such as maternal and child health, death and childbirth, and even things like maternity leave related to the rights of women to both work and have their maternity recognized as a part of their condition and something that must be protected. We have the Convention Against Torture and Cruel and Inhumane Degrading Treatment and Punishment. That would be important for war zones and our engagement in those environments. But really importantly, and underscored here, is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, this is underscored because this is the most universally agreed upon convention in the world. And all countries have now signed, and every country except the United States has ratified the convention. And by ratification, I mean entered the convention into complete legal force within the countries with laws that recognize the rights of children. So that convention is important to recognize because it very much focuses on, one, the best interests of the child, and two, the ideas of children being equal regardless of their race, nationality, creed, ethnicity, and that their rights are critical to the fundamental to the development of society. Those ideas that are found in the Convention on the Rights of the Child are the most agreed upon in the world because it'd be very difficult to find anyone who would vote against child rights. And then the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, this is an important convention for social workers because obviously we're deeply committed to vulnerable people, not just children, but people with disabilities. And you would even find issues related to dementia care and other ideas at the other end of life with persons with disabilities. Remember, we all come into the world vulnerable and we all leave the world vulnerable if we live to our fullest lifespan. So disabilities ranges the life's course, and we must always recognize that there are special needs of people with disabilities. So what is the role of the United Nations? The UN is responsible for monitoring human rights abuses, and you can make complaints to the United Nations about human rights abuses. And in fact, countries must submit a report to the UN every 5 years, and they must submit a report as to whether or not the conventions are being followed, and if not, is the country making progress towards this goal? Of course, countries can't be perfect, and they're always in stages of moving towards the goals, and we need to recognize that each country is at its own developmental stage and progress towards realizing human rights. And the non-governmental organizations, and we might consider these small nonprofit organizations, can submit reports. And these are sometimes called shadow reports to help the UN get a more accurate assessment in countries that are trying to hide their human rights abuses. And some have said that non-governmental organizations or small nonprofits are actually the arm of the human rights defenders because those reports become sometimes the most transparent and readily available information that really gives the true and full reality of the circumstances in countries where there are grave human rights abuses. Human Rights Watch is one example of that such an organization that exists globally, and they monitor different problems like early child marriage, really good work in Malawi. They have other issues around rights to fair trials, free speech. They have different initiatives globally that you can start to follow if you're concerned about a particular human rights issue. And they make clear where the problems lie and what the possible solutions are. And they've even started to recognize social workers as human rights defenders. So, how does this work? The United Nations is a global organization and is made up of almost every country in the world, and it promotes and protects human rights through several key human rights bodies. The most important one for our discussion today is the Human Rights Council. And before we start, I will tell you that the United States has been in and out of the council at various different presidential administrations. During the George Bush administration, it was out of the council. Then during the Obama administration, it was in the council. And then again, underneath the Trump administration, removed from the council again. But this charter of the UN called for the creation of the intergovernmental body, which is called this council, and it's responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights worldwide. The Human Rights Council consists of 47 UN member countries that meet regularly to conduct a universal periodic review of human rights in all countries around the world, to address situations of human rights violations, to receive complaints, and to make recommendations on how to improve the fulfillment of human rights. So just because the United States is not on the council, that does not mean that the United States is not given reprimand or acknowledge that there are serious human rights problems existing in the country. And that's one of the reasons why some presidential administrations pull out of the Human Rights Council in a kind of a way of showing disapproval that the United States would be condemned for a human rights abuse. So the Human Rights Council actually meets in Geneva, Switzerland, and 48 countries have representative of the councils based on their population. So you can see different regions of the world and the amount of seats that they hold. I'm sure that this interactive dialogue picture is important to you as you think about the Universal Periodic Review, and look at the circular shape at which people sit. This idea that everybody comes together equally without discrimination, and the ideas of equality are captured in this photograph. So the human rights approach for social work, we recognize there are three main barriers to prevent people from the protection of all their human rights. Poverty, absolutely. Amnesty International has recognized that poverty is the main barrier to realizing human rights. And this is incredibly important for us to remember because poverty remains a serious problem in the United States. Then there's discrimination. Remember that discrimination is part of the idea of countering ideas related to equality. With equality, we don't have discrimination. And then that's all connected to the lack of education. And we want to ask ourselves, how do we prevent these barriers in people's everyday life? That's what social workers are committed to. Do we have examples in your community or larger community in promoting the end of discrimination, trying to remedy poverty, and try to overcome lack of education, and that includes poor quality education systems? So remember, understanding our rights are key, and that we have overcrowded classrooms, not enough teachers, and unqualified teachers, and including things like school fees. We know that the current reality around the world is related to these barriers. And then when rights are standards, we have classrooms that have good teacher-student ratios, qualified teachers with a free education. Remember, a free education is critical in that article related to education. This is, again, a part of Amnesty International's initiative to educate globally on the rights to education. That promotion is important as we consider social justice and everyone having equal rights, opportunities, and protection under the law. We know that social justice is fundamental to social work, and in fact, we recognize that human rights are a part of that work, and I would argue that human rights help us to anchor social justice when sometimes social justice feels abstract. So remember, social work's ethical codes mandate that we promote social and economic justice, and we promote human rights and freedom of individuals to create humane societal conditions that uphold the values of worth, dignity, and uniqueness of all persons. These principles and the Code of Ethics delineate the social worker's responsibilities with respect to society. And remember, we must promote the general welfare of society, facilitate public participation and democracy, respond to public emergencies with appropriate and evidence-based strategies for social services. We must provide access to persons in need of resources and opportunities. We must expand opportunities for everyone, especially for persons who are disadvantaged or disenfranchised. Those are our vulnerable populations, and we always want to prevent and eliminate all forms of exploitation and discrimination. This is very much consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the related conventions and other instruments that we've talked about thus far. So, connection between social justice and human rights. Remember that human rights are based on human dignity as universal and applying to all. Equality is the core of the idea of human rights, as we expect the society that does not discriminate, and that means discriminate against individuals and groups. Human rights articles like the right to an education help us be very specific about and even anchor ideas of social justice. When we start to think about our own circumstances and our own systems of access to education, some of the problems become quite clear. But also there are other ideas like the right to seek refuge and safety in another country. That's asylum seeking, the right to seek the opportunity to be a refugee from war zones. And then there are other ideas like the right to a fair trial. Now let's talk about really quickly about the right to a fair trial. What are we learning as we continue to digest the Black Lives Matter movement? Can we even trust our policing? These are critical questions that we must move forward, and we consider our civil rights and fundamental freedoms within the United States as well as around the world. Do we really have a right to a fair trial if policing is unfair, if people are dying at the hands of police, if we don't trust our police? The Black Lives Matter movement provides us a lot of opportunity as social workers to self-reflect on how we may become agents and facilitators of change within this civil rights discourse. So, human dignity. This is the core idea that connects our code of ethics and social work as a profession to the human rights declarations. Here we go. We have a graphic that covers human dignity, the profession, and social work purpose, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and human dignity being the connecting concept. Respect for the individual and the society is what human dignity ultimately means. Human respect, human kindness, and social justice for all humans. So as we move forward in social work, we want to recognize that advocacy or human rights defense is critical as social workers help clients to seek social justice and realize their human rights. We help clients in their cause, like in the case of Flint, Michigan, the rights to clean water, to seek ways to make social change. Often we help others find their voice and make different forums systematically influence policymakers who are the decision makers in unfair social systems. For social workers, client advocacy is an ethical responsibility. Let's consider the application of human rights to clean water as we think about Flint, Michigan again. Now, in 2010, the United Nations recognized the right to water and sanitation underneath Resolution 64-292. Now, this is an example of, even though the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in 1948, today we have ongoing discussions and ongoing resolutions that are consistent through the United Nations General Assembly, which explicitly, in this case, recognized the human right to water and sanitation and acknowledged that clean water and sanitation are essential to realizing of all human rights. The resolution calls upon states and international organizations to provide financial resources, help capacity building, and technological transfer to help countries, and particularly developing countries, to provide clean, safe, accessible, and affordable drinking water and sanitation for all. In the case of the United States, a very high resource or wealthy country, the United Nations has actually stood in judgment of the United States based on the Flint, Michigan water crisis. And those comments have been made about rights to clean water and rights to not be polluted by your water, is recognizing that human rights includes the right to clean water, and it's connected directly to human dignity. And it's a prerequisite for the realization of other human rights. Without clean water, you can't realize other human rights because it's most fundamental to human survival. Comment number 15 also defined the right to water as the right to everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic uses. Again, we must provide available water, that's availability. We must provide affordable water, that's affordability. We must provide acceptable water, that is acceptable water and cleanness. And then we must provide safe water quality, and that is safety and availability. So, the Human Rights Watch, which I mentioned before as a non governmental organization that works in advocacy, has specifically looked at Flint, Michigan, and the problems there related to the lead contamination and the poisoning of the community of Flint. Now, some tests showed that water had 100 times the legal level of lead in Flint, and the poisoning of Flint's water crisis was considered to be an unmitigated disaster by Human Rights Watch. So, what happened? The lead pipes in the city were the source of contamination. And even though it was known that those lead pipes were contaminating the community, which was mainly African American, the lack of respect for human rights and dignity was led to mass scale poisoning that affected at least 6,000 to 12,000 children. And the outcomes for growth and development include brain damage and the results in intellectual disabilities for children. However, there's been a major movement forward in justice, and in August 2020, a legal award was granted to the residents of Flint, with the $600 million being awarded to the community, and 80% of that money going to children and their families as a way to remediate the crisis and respond to the crisis so that people can better access their rights and eliminate this problem of contamination of water. So the case against Flint officials' responsibility in tainted water is one of the reports that Human Rights Watch provided. Now, this is an example of Human Rights Watch as a non-governmental organization seeking to provide documentation above and beyond the United States recognition of a problem in Flint. In fact, we know that the United States was slow to response, and in fact, the government officials in Michigan were held accountable to some degree for their abuse of their people by not making sure that the lead-based water problem was being identified and changed or revealed to the people and made the idea is that the real reveal the people makes immediate changes in the environmental conditions and the problems that were persisting in Flint, including racism and discrimination, because in fact, it really comes down to racism and discrimination that was the underlying factor for the people of Flint. So we have a lawsuit. We have the facts. The residents of the Flint, Michigan, were the participants in the lawsuit. We already talked about 6,000 to 12,000 children being exposed to lead. We know it was a public health state of emergency, and there was at least 79 lawsuits. In several investigations, we had resignations of city officials. We had people being fired, and we had people being suspended. There were people facing criminal indictments, and all but one of those was dismissed or overturned. One person was found guilty, and then there's a statute of limitations on the felony misconduct of in-office charges expiry on April 25th, 2020. So we know that there was at least 12 deaths and an estimated several hundred additional pregnancies ended in stillbirth. So that's the idea of human rights for all, regardless of race, religion, and the importance of protecting pregnancy. And pregnancy is covered underneath the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. In addition to these ideas of rights to water and health found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we know that there were people who had faced charges, one was convicted, and now we have that $600 million settlement. But let's recognize that the sentence of the one person that was actually found guilty was only a 1 year probation and 300 hours of community service and a fine of $1,200. This is a lack of response in many ways by the government to really hold those accountable to what most people considered to be ineffective or almost basically a slap in the face to the people of Flint, Michigan, with the government's lack of response to the irresponsible government officials that acted in a discriminatory manner. The $600 million lawsuit will go a good distance in starting to achieve the human rights that are necessary, but the reality is the lack of criminal conviction still stings the people of Flint, Michigan. So the U.S. government and the state and municipal authorities have stubbornly refused to acknowledge the people's right to clean water. In 2014, a U.S. federal judge in Michigan ruled that there was no enforceable right to water after the city of Detroit started massive shutoffs of household water supplies if people did not pay their water bill. And we know that for years, the United Nations, the United States tried to distance itself from the global recognition of this human right. In 2015, it finally joined the consensus at the UN General Assembly in acknowledging the right to water, entitled everyone to, quote, have access to sufficient, safe, and acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic use. So there we have sufficient, safe, acceptable, and accessible ideas there as the United States finally came around in 2015 to these ideas. But it wasn't ratified by a major treaty addressing the right to water, and ultimately this has sidestepped the idea the right could be applied to United States citizens. Water is, we know, a human right, and the disaster in Flint is just one of the many ways that the right to water has been jeopardized in the United States. The victims of Flint have the right to remedy the harm suffered. Government authorities at the national, state, and local level need policies that both guarantee drinking water and secure the future of water so that we don't have the same experience in Flint, Michigan again, or anywhere else in the United States. So, advocacy, what can we do as social workers? Environmental justice is getting increasing attention in social work in the United States, and that means we must be aware of the kinds of conditions that are environmentally unjust. We must speak out in our advocacy work and help others speak out. In the case of water, we must demand that we have clean water rather than unsafe water. That's water safety. We have to look for water availability, and that means adequate supplies of water. That is critically important around the world as more and more countries are starting to have inadequate clean water supply, and that comes to quality. Do we have acceptable water? In Flint, we did not have acceptable water. And then, of course, affordability. I think this picture of bottled water is an important reminder that we are starting to buy our water rather than consider municipal water sources safe, available, acceptable. And this is going to be a major burden to people in poverty, but it's unjust to everyone because municipal water systems are critically important to the survival of all. It is a fundamental human right. So as we become increasingly involved in environmental justice, water is just one real and persistent concern. Other problems include air quality. If you think about the recent fires in California, those problems are related to climate change and what we call global warming. Social workers must get involved because the quality of life, the well-being of everyone we serve is impacted in a universal and undeniable way related to environmental justice. So as advocates or human rights defenders, we must be aware and speak out in our expectations for clean, available, acceptable, and affordable water. So here we have the appendix of human rights as related to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. See article number 1, equal and dignity, that's human dignity. Recognize Article 4, the prohibition of slavery, prohibition of torture. Article 5. Article 7, all must be treated equal before the law and under the law. That's the right to a fair trial. That would also be connected to Article 9, the prohibition of arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. Again, more about the rights of the person before the law. People shall be presumed innocent until proven guilty. We recognize that as fundamental to freedoms of justice and civil rights in the United States. So you can see that the United States is codifying many of these ideas, but that is not necessarily being realized in the application of day-to-day life. So here we have Article 13, 14, and 15. These are really connected to major ideas around citizenship, nationality, our ability to move freely in our country as well amongst countries. And when you need to seek safety elsewhere, that's the right to seek asylum. And that comes directly from the 1948 ideas coming after the World War II and the need to seek safety in another country from Germany as well as other countries. So Article 16 is really interesting because the right to marriage must be consented by both parties, and the family is entitled to the protection of the state. Now think about child marriage. Marriage must be consented to by both parties. Children are not able to make consent, and we know that as social workers. However, many countries still allow child marriage. In fact, there are some states in the United States that allow for children to be married if their family makes that consent for them. This is an opportunity for making change in the United States, and most people aren't even aware of this reality. But we as social workers, if we work in those states, must move forward from a child rights perspective and try to eliminate this problem. So you can think of freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Again, freedom of religion in Article 18. We also recognize the freedom of opinion and expression, which is critical in our democracies, and the right to assemble and have association, right to participate in the government of one's country, and the right to economic, social, and cultural rights necessary for dignity and free development of personality. Then again, we have this idea of reaching our fullest potential as human beings. Right to work and equitable compensation. And here, look at Article 24, the right to rest and leisure from work. That starts to address the rights of fairness of employment, and including rights of not to be enslaved to one's employment. We have a right to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. This speaks very directly to poverty in the United States as elsewhere, as well as our health and human services systems. Our health systems, we know, are inadequate in the United States, and the policies related to medical care are unjust. And that's one of the reasons why in the United States, as well as elsewhere, we must continue to advocate for the right to medical care. We've already talked about the right to education. And look at number 30. None of the rights may be interpreted as following any action to destroy these rights. So destroying the rights is unacceptable. And we all have duties in the community. Rights shall be limited only in regard to respecting the rights of others. Thank you.